All right, lovely people. Today I'm sitting down with Keith Heggart and we're talking about his new book, which is called, Keith, what's it called?
Uh, Activist Citizenship Education, a framework for justice citizens.
Oh, did it without checking. That's amazing. Just so that everyone's aware of who you are and what you do, I've just finished reading Different Hats, Different Voices, Different Jobs, the Pro-Academic Experience. Do you want to sort of take us through the life cycle that led you to being Dr. Heggart?
Yeah, I'd love to. And thank you, Stephen, for having me on the podcast. So, I guess in many ways I'm not your traditional academic. I scraped through my teaching degree, and then I decided I was going to travel the world. So I ended up teaching over in a place called Thurrock in England for a little while, well, for about 5 years. Then lots of teaching in Western Sydney and different kinds of leadership roles and different kinds of schools. But as I was teaching, I got really passionate about, teachers being treated with the respect that the profession deserves. I mean, everyone will talk about the importance and the necessity of education, and there seems to be this weird kind of disconnect to me that we don't have this same level of respect for the people who actually practice the profession. And that led me to getting involved with one of the big teaching unions in Australia. I was an organiser with them for 5 years, doing a lot of work around professional development and activism, especially with young teachers and early teachers. And during that time, I was fortunate enough to get some work teaching, firstly at Western Sydney University and then at the University of Technology, Sydney, where I got involved in pre-service teaching and education. And as part of that journey, I thought, you know what, I really enjoy this kind of thing, and I decided to undertake a doctorate. And you might have noticed that, I'm passionate about teacher agency and teacher voice, but equally student agency and student voice, and that became the focus for my doctorate. Yeah.
Gotcha. And just so that we can sort of get definitions out of the way, I guess, do you want to talk us through citizenship, activism, how they all sort of fit together to sort of lay the foundation for what we're talking about here?
Yeah, absolutely. So I take a different view of citizenship to the one that is most common, certainly within political circles, but it is becoming more common. My broader definition of citizenship. So, citizenship is a term that's been used so much that it's almost become meaningless, and it often has to have something added in front of it to make it more meaningful. So you might have heard about consumer citizenship or sustainable citizenship or global citizenship, or my personal favorite, active citizenship. And I think that's an attempt to move away from that very old-fashioned, though still important, political definition of citizenship, as in, a relationship between an individual and a state. You are a citizen of a country. And that's going back to the 50s and beyond, and it draws its roots from that notion of subjects. We don't talk about people being subjects to the state anymore, but that's essentially what that definition of citizenship means. I would suggest citizen, in this modern day and age, is somebody with what we might call agentic potential, someone who can do something, someone who can take action. So in my definition of citizenship, I would say let's not limit it to someone who is 18. Let's not limit it to someone who has a political relationship with the state. Let's just talk about somebody who is active and participating in a democracy. And I think that's the place where it gets really interesting. Now that leads into a discussion about what does it actually mean to be active and activism. And the first thing I'll say is that activism often gets, from some areas of the media, the press, academia, politicians, activism gets this terrible rap. And we have visions of people destroying things and tying themselves to trees and all of that kind of stuff. And I'd say that is activism. And personally, I would say we need to celebrate that form of activism as well. But I would say activism is so much more than just that. There are levels of activism, and I would consider activism to be clicking like or following a page on a cause that you believe in. as much as I would consider it to be tying yourself to a tree or writing a letter to a politician. And, you know, one of the things that I was particularly interested in this research is the idea that our tools, our avenues, our affordances for activism have really diversified thanks to, you know, the breadth and the scope and the uptake of technology. And the final thing that I'll just say about activism is that, you know, for Australian school teachers out there, it's written in what was the Melbourne Declaration, and then more recently the Alice Springs Parkway Declaration. You know, it's one of the goals of schooling, developing active and informed members of the community. I'll note that the Alice Springs Declaration actually changed active and informed citizens to active and informed members of the community, which I actually think is a good change, because it's much more inclusive. You know, I've taught for long enough to know that not everyone in my classroom is officially a citizen of Australia, and I wouldn't want them to be excluded from the opportunity to participate in the democracy solely because of their political citizenship status.
Gotcha. And just because I'd never heard of it myself, the TLA, or the three-letter acronym, is CCE, so Civic Citizenship Education. Is that sort of the nomenclature that you're familiar with?
Yeah, traditionally, civics and citizenship education is seen as two quite separate notions smashed together, and in schools in the past, it's lent more towards civics education. So civics education is about the machinery, the institution of government. You know, so I teach pre-service primary teachers at the moment, and we're doing a lot of stuff about you know, how does government work? How do you teach young people about government, about federal government, about state government? That is classically civics approaches to education or content. The citizenship side of things is less didactic, I think, and more exploratory and participatory. You know, so this is where we get the opportunity to talk about you know, protest movements and you know, engagement in social movements. And rights and inequality and justice. And it's interesting that in the UK, they adopted a citizenship subject that was compulsory, I think, to year 9. And then you could do a GCSE in it as well. You know, they left behind the civic side of things, although there is elements of that that's covered in the citizenship subject, but they wanted to focus on, you know, the participation and being active in society, the citizenship side of things.
Right, gotcha. And then I guess I'm going to try and control myself with this, because it's kind of, this is one of the areas of teaching, education, studies, whatever, where it seems like any event that happens, people can, you know, like when Black Lives Matter came through, people would say, oh, you know, how would you feel about that? How does your vision feel about that? And so I'm going to do that. I'm going to try and only do that once. But Cameron Melch has asked me a question. He said, how do you feel about the teaching of civics in the current, you know, what's happening with the government in Australia, and the sort of, you know, basically his concept was, if the politicians aren't following the rules, the civic responsibilities, all those sort of things, how should we or could we teach CCE to those sort of people? So that's a question without notice, but how would you sort of dabble into that one?
Thanks, Cameron. Great question. No, it is, you know, ultimately, and this is going to sound quite blunt, but I think our politics is a reflection of ourselves. You know, I think civics and citizenship education is taught fantastically well in some places, but in lots of other places, and I was one of these teachers not that long ago, it's not taught well at all. It's kind of jammed in. You know, despite the fact that it's given prominence in the Alice Springs Parkway Declaration, in reality, it's seen as this very, very much a junior brother of history and geography in New South Wales, and it's just not embraced by teachers, and a lot of that is because teachers don't feel confident in and of themselves. On one hand, they're very nervous and rightly nervous about doing anything to do with politics in the classroom, because they know, you know, whatever they say, there's probably someone waiting to jump up and down on top of them. And that's the nature of being a teacher in Australia in the 21st century. But also, so many of them are are not well prepared by their undergraduate or even their postgraduate degrees to teach about this kind of stuff. It is not simple. It can be taught well, but you've got to provide expertise, time, space, and support to do it. However, and the beauty of it is, and part of the reason why I get so passionate about it, is because it's so very, very relevant. You know, I think if our politics is a reflection of our own agency, our own expression of what we think is important, the solution is to do it better. We need to teach it better. We need to show people that they are the fundamental principle of democracy, and the decisions that they make or don't make, the research that they do or don't do, will have significant impacts upon the kind of leaders that we have. You know, so more broadly speaking, I think if more of us were better educated about you know, equality and justice and the rights of everybody within Australian democracies, we might have a better quality of politician.
Nice. Well said. And then Sue Thompson, who's the CEO of research at ASA, she sort of runs PISA for us. She mentioned that Australia doesn't participate in a test of civics education, like similar to a PISA or a TALIS, which looks at teaching, or a PEARLS, etc., etc. Apparently there's an international test for like civics education, and the Education Council decided that we wouldn't participate in that. My assumption is that Australia would do terribly at such a test. Is that, you're obviously much more informed than me. Do you think we would do poorly, or is that just my reaching too far from my reading of your book?
Yeah, I don't know. I think that's a fascinating question. I do know that in the, you know, one of the reasons that I decided to do this research and eventually end up writing the book was because in our NAPLAN Civics and Citizenship assessments, you know, so sorry, that's the NAPCC, not the NAPLAN, but it's the same national assessment program, and it's only done with a selection of schools rather than every child in year 5, year 7, year 9. We always do really, really terribly. I think in about 20 years there has been no improvement whatsoever. You know, I think in year 5, about half of the students who do this test meet the minimum proficiency standard. Okay, so they about half just make the grade, and the rest don't even make the grade. And then in year 10, it's even worse. Less than half, I think, fail to meet the minimum proficiency standard. But these aren't tests of civics and citizenship, whatever we mean by that. These are tests of civic literacy. You know, so, I think it's a really interesting conversation about how much do you actually need about civic literacy? How much civic knowledge do you need to be an active citizen? And I would say that while, you know, one might contribute to the other, it's not a direct correlation. And you know, I think there are plenty of examples of that. The Occupy movement, which you might remember, was pretty big in the US and around the world. You know, a lot of people involved in that had quite low levels of civic literacy, but it didn't stop them being what I would call active citizens, justice-oriented citizens, if we wanted to use that terminology. And I think the same is probably true of the recent climate movements, the climate strikes, organised, led by, and supported by young people across Australia. The reality is, and I guess this is kind of the whole thrust of my research, it's not, you know, it's not civic literacy leads to active citizenship. I would suggest that the two actually relate to each other. You know, we develop our civic literacy through the practice of active citizenship. You know, I'm going to betray my ideological leanings here, but you know, John Dewey, you know, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, spent a lot of time writing about democracy as a verb. We do democracy. We are not a democracy. And I don't think we've got much further than that. I'd agree entirely with it. So to get back to your question, would we do poorly in tests of civic literacy? Oh, possibly, yeah. You know, but how do you even have an international test of civic literacy? Yeah. I mean, active citizenship means, active citizenship itself is contextual. Active citizenship in South Korea might look very differently to active citizenship in Walgett, New South Wales. Yeah.
So I guess to give colour to your theory, it'd be like being a young or old feminist. You're doing your march for justice. You're on the bus to Canberra. You're waiting out the front. You're protesting, and it's kind of like, does it matter if you know the names of all the people inside Parliament House or not? Because that you're being an active citizen by your framing, but do you require the civics knowledge to know, well, you know, the Hansard just walked past, or you know, that sort of that kind of minutiae or not? And so I guess, yeah, are you saying they're not linked at all, or is there some connection between the two, do you think?
Well, the great criticism of civics, specifically civics education in Australia, is that young people don't care about it. They have no interest with it. And you know, the classic example was Discovering Democracy, which came in about 1997. And you know, there was a lot of money for teacher professional development, which ran out too quickly. And there was a lot of money spent on what were quite fantastic resources for teachers to use. I've used them, I remember them. But what it was missing, and you know, lots of people picked up on this straight away, was a relevance to situate it in the, you know, the practice of teachers, but also, it's more importantly, the practice of young people. You know, you need to get on that bus and go to that March for Justice to have a reason to learn civic literacy. You know, yeah, or equally, you need to take part in online meetups about climate strikes to have a reason to say, I want to do something. You know, people, very few people, some people do, but very few people learn about politics and civics and the mechanics of government solely for the sake of learning about the mechanics of government. It's because they want to make a change, and that's what we should do. We should situate our education right there as a starting point.
Yeah, I think I could be wrong, but I remember right at the start of my career using Discovering Democracy resources, and I remember like, you know, it'd be like, okay, who's everyone in all the political parties, and it would be me Googling the lesson before and going, you know, which generic white man slots into which particular role. And then if I think of now, like especially in Victoria, especially, like everyone knows, like who knew there was a chief health officer, for example, until now. And I think a lot of students, whether the word is politicized or not, but they're definitely much more aware of the systems and the structures. And like, you know, you could probably have a pretty rough approximation of federalism with, you know, like a 12 or 13-year-old who understands I'm not allowed to go to the skate park during lockdown, but in Queensland they can, kind of thing. So there's definitely something there. Do you think this kind of current time will bring about anything positive in that regard? Like maybe if we were to do the NAPCC, would there be a slight bump in civic awareness, perhaps? Or
yeah, no. Oh, good question. I would say yes, because I think people are suddenly, you know, for the first time in a long time, I've got pre-service teachers, you know, who are often, you know, 21, 22 years old, who are now talking about, you know, the difference in powers between the Commonwealth and the state governments, and, you know, where quarantine lies and where education lies, and you know, arguing from a point of some knowledge, and it's great to see. So yeah, I think you know, this crisis, as terrible as it has been, has provided avenues for people to learn more about the workings of government. But also, I think it's provided some really interesting examples of, you know, what we might mean by active citizenship. You know, so the people who are protesting the lockdown, would we classify them as active citizens? You know, and at what point do we say, you know, your free speech is important, but it's not as important as public health? You know, there are some European scholars of social movements and democracy and civics and citizenship who say, you know, the most important time for a democracy is not in the actual running of it, but it's when the rules are being made. You know, when we're reinventing what democracy means, because that's where we define those kind of rules of engagement, what we're allowed to do and what we're not allowed to do. And I think in many ways, the ubiquitousness of mobile, digital, social technologies has meant that some of those rules of engagement are open to debate. And I think that's fascinating, and also really scary. So while I think, maybe there might be a slight bump in the NAPCC, perhaps, we also need to be more mindful of the fact that things like myths and disinformation will now be much easier to be spread far more widely. And there are, for want of a better term, bad faith actors who are taking part in our discussions in our civic sphere. And as a teacher, that fills me with concern, because I'm like, how on earth do we prepare students to go out into this world where there are people who are deliberately targeting them to change their minds, to get an outcome that they want that might not be in their best interests? Yeah, scary.
Yeah. I mean, the idea of Clicktivism, for me, the names that I link to that are Howard Stevenson and Yelmer Evers. I think your book, was it Butler, 2001 or something? What are your thoughts on it's probably a bit of a dated idea now when you're talking about what you just mentioned, which is sort of the polarization of politicization, like Clicktivism or, mere Clicktivism, the idea that, I've liked a Facebook post and changed my profile picture and that's sort of all I've done. What's your stance on how that fits into the sort of picture of activist citizenship?
Yeah, and this is a really interesting area of social movements, I guess, more broadly. But within the field of civics and citizenship, I think in the past there's been a tendency to try to separate the physical real from the virtual real, and to suggest that they operate independently from each other, and the physical real is always better than the virtual real for engendering social change. More recently, I've seen lots of people saying, well, actually, no, we need to explore the links between the two, and to see if, the physical real the virtual real, like the Clicktivism or the Slacktivism, it's sometimes called, engenders more physical activism, more physical civics and citizenship action. But again, I think we probably even need to move beyond that. And Zainab Tufekci, who's written a lot about this kind of stuff, she talks a lot about how, because it's so easy to make connections, it's so easy to organise events via social media, it's so easy to share information, it's so easy to like a page. There's no actual, you're not put out because you don't have to get in the car and go to a meeting, catch a bus, to go to a street to hand out flyers. You can do it all from the comfort of your own couch in front of the TV. She suggests that this means that there's been a proliferation of social movements, but they're not as strong as they used to be, because the people within the social movements haven't had the chance to build that kind of, social capital between each other, that they can then rely on when it gets difficult. I'm not as skeptical as Tufekci is on that. I think it's actually, young people today use their device, and older people use their devices for social movement organising, for civics and citizenship activism, simply because that's just how they do it. It's the way we live our lives today. I've got a book launch coming up, for this book. In the past, we would have all got together in a room, probably had to cancel it in pandemic times. But now we just put it up on Eventbrite, and suddenly people from all over the world are going to come to this book launch. So I think the criticism of Slacktivism is a little bit unfounded. I think it's more about how these new tools are used that determines their effectiveness. So I don't think the solution is to get everybody, trying to do what they might have done in a face-to-face environment online. the solution is to use the affordances that are available. And the best example, I think, is probably one of the union campaigns about Streets Ice Cream. So Streets Ice Cream was launching a new ice cream, and some of the workers were on strike. And what the union did was organise lots and lots of people to you know, I guess we'd call it Zoom bomb, but it was Facebook bombing, the launch of that particular ice cream, questioning why they weren't looking after their workers. And the streets tried to cancel it, and it didn't, you know, and then they restarted it, and they all did it again. And, you know, ultimately, that kind of online activism had real concrete effects, and, you know, the workers got a decent result out of it. So, you know, that would be a new wave kind of Clicktivism, as opposed to old wave ineffective Clicktivism.
Gotcha. And just to broaden it out, because otherwise we'll be limited by my limited political awareness. In the book, you talk about Extinction Rebellion 350.org, Hong Kong and the Umbrella Movement, and a whole bunch of other sort of examples of activism around the world that probably will tie together your sort of the way that social media was used as well. Do you want to just pick a couple of those that spring to mind and sort of talk us through some examples of how they bear out the kind of things covered in your book?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many of these really interesting ones. And one of the points that I try to make in the book is that often these are not just, they don't just have a presence of young people. They're often led by young people, which I think is really quite impressive. And what I am fascinated about it is how these are often quite separate chapters, I guess you'd call them, separate groups, often geographically loaded, that all provide support and solidarity for a much larger global movement. So the Fridays for the Future movement is a fascinating example of this, because there are Fridays for the Future chapters using social media, you know, from everywhere, from India to the US to South America to Australia, and they all have this kind of network where they follow each other and they retweet each other's points, but they all exist independently as well. And I think that kind of global but local scope is something that is new to social movement organising and active citizenship. I mean, you know, one of the great things about that school strike for climate was not just that the organisers managed to mobilise people across Australia, from tiny little country towns all the way up to places like Melbourne and Sydney and Canberra, but they did it in the scope of a global movement. You know, there were school strikes for climate in New York and in London and in Paris, all over the world. You know, I just think that's wonderful. You know, other examples, you know, perhaps one of the most successful ones is the March for Our Lives movement. So this came after the shooting at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas School in Florida. You know, and the school shooting, you know, narrative is pretty grim in the US. But some of the survivors decided they were going to organise, and they formed a movement called March for Our Lives. And I think within the space of a month, the Florida governor had changed the gun laws. And you think, you know, it's been 40 years and the US has been struggling for any kind of traction in terms of gun laws. And suddenly, you know, within a month, these young school students had mobilised enough people and enough support that legislators were being dragged to the, you know, to the chambers to make changes to the laws that were in accordance with what they want. Now, obviously, that's one small example, and there's huge challenges still facing, you know, the gun control movement in the US. But now, again, the same kind of thing is happening. There are local chapters across much of the US who, and they are actively participating in you know, democratic elections. You know, they are supporting. And beyond party lines as well, you know, they're quite happy to call out, you know, people who they might might be seen as broadly progressive, but are regressive on gun control. And I think that's an interesting aspect of it as well. Yeah.
Amazing. Just for personal interest, really, you talk about complexity theory. I think I've delved into that as very much a non-academic at points. I think Oliver Elzinga has corrected me on many of my understandings. I know you only used it sort of in a relatively limited way to talk about what do you call it? Something borrowing, theoretical borrowing,
theoretical
or something.
borrowing. Yeah.
I love that term. I'm going to use that a lot more now. Do you want to give us how complexity theory fits into sort of, because very much your work is sort of moving beyond the direct instruction. I taught them about Parliament and whatever else towards a bit more of a engaging with complexity. Do you want to just sort of talk us through how that works?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think in terms of subjects like civics and citizenship education, there needs to be a recognition that it's different to other subjects. Like, it's different to the study of English literature. It's different to the study of algebraic equations. And the reason it's different is because, to use that very broad definition, young people are already citizens of the world. They're already active. They already have their own levels of knowledge and understanding that they want to try to apply and bring to any kind of conversation. And I think that's a good thing. They should be encouraged to do that. Now, traditionally, there's been this notion of critical pedagogy, which grew out of the popular education movement of Paulo Freire, and then in more North American ideas like Henri Giraud and Peter McLaren and other critical pedagogues. And that's led to things like critical race theory and culturally relevant pedagogy and all of those notions, as it's tried to grapple with not just class, but also race and gender and the different axes of oppression that might exist. In terms of my approach to it, so I departed a little bit from critical pedagogical approaches, education as the practice of freedom, education for empowerment, and tried to match that with this notion of, firstly, rather than an individual focus, looking at one student, more towards a much broader, looking at a class and a school and a community and how they all interact together. So straight away we have incredibly complex mechanisms and everyone influences everyone else in different ways. But one of the ideas of complexity theory is that sometimes organisation can occur quite spontaneously in these what appear to be disorganised systems. And I think that is often a really good analogy. Leadership or policy positions emerge from the kind of the morass of active citizens who want to do something. And suddenly people become figureheads. It does them a disservice. They become leaders. They become community leaders about social issues. And organisations that are active take on leadership roles, and I think that's a fascinating idea. The other thing that I was really conscious about was that I certainly wouldn't feel comfortable, indoctrinating students about my own political beliefs or leanings. And certainly that's something that lots of teachers are very, very nervous about. So we needed to find a way to encourage students and learners to be able to have the confidence to make their own decisions. And another feature of complexity theory is this notion of distributed decision making. So decision making is spread throughout the whole mechanism, and I think that's a really interesting way of moving from that common paradigm in education, which is often teacher-centered, and now it's become more learner-centered. But I'd even go one step further and talk about learner-led. Who better to talk about the issues in their community than the young people who live in that community. You know, but in the past we might not have done that. We might have said, no, we're all going to look at you know, cycleways or parking or something like that. And if you're a 14-year-old child, you're like, I don't care about parking. I want to talk about the skateboard park, or I want to talk about the environment. You know, so I think that notion of distributing decision making, and then finally the idea of emergent learning. You know, this is very constructivist and socially constructivist in that we build under our own meaning through our own interactions and experiences with the world. You know, so learning is subjective. You know, we all have our different understandings, rather than there being, you know, this unquestionable knowledge that is passed from teacher to student. You know, and I think never has that been more required than in a field like civics and citizenship education. You know? But how do we construct the pedagogies that allow this to take place? You know, so one of the other areas of my interest is in around designing for learning. You know, so how do we design to allow for emergent learning to come through? And one of the very first articles, it was in the IBM journal by Kurtz and Snowden. You know, they talk about how order can sometimes emerge from chaos. And the great example they give is, I think, of a primary school teacher who doesn't raise her voice, who doesn't, you know, can't insist upon, you know, certain kind of behaviours or anything like that, because they don't have that kind of authority in the way that the police do. They don't have coercive authority, but who constructs a learning environment that gets everybody to learn. You know, I just think that, isn't that the most wonderful example of what teachers do? You know, we shape, we direct, we guide. Yeah, and I think that's even more the case in civics and citizenship education.
Yeah, amazing. So we've sort of gone down to the classroom. So I feel we should take a step or two back and talk about, so you've mentioned discovering democracy, and then, which, like for me especially, was like a distant past that I found on the internet rather than an embodied thing. Then there was values education that very much happened while I was teaching, and we all had Simpson's donkey up on the wall. And then you transition into David Zinger's Are You Mad? Kind of, which is heading much, sort of, to me, I see it anyway, as sort of moving from very direct instruction, dictatorial, whatever you want to call it, teaching. Are You Mad opens it up a lot more. And then your conception of just a citizen sort of is, as you say, very emergent learning, constructivist, however you want to frame it. How have I done it, sort of summarising the rough timeline as a very much rank outsider? Does that sort of fit with what you've got?
Yeah, no, absolutely. The only thing I'd add to it is that, you know, at the same time as discovering democracy, there was very much a broader international perspective, you know, which sometimes it got put down to millennial anxiety, but there was real genuine concern that you know, young people in the 90s were not taking democracy seriously, and that always makes me laugh, because, oh, you know, here we are back in 2021, and suddenly we're having the same conversation, quite literally, the same conversation. And it is one of those hot button issues that you're guaranteed to get lots of awareness about it. You would have seen recently that, you know, in Australia and more broadly, there's been a whole host of, you know, research that's come out that's saying that, you know, lots of young people are now in favour of like a military dictatorship rather than a democratic state, or young people, you know, have less trust in their elected representatives than they have had for many years. And you know, the thing to keep in mind, I think, is that a lot of this research is really quite heavily contested, and it's troubling, because I think we should always take any research indicating a loss of faith in democracy seriously. But I think in the grand scheme of things, I'm not entirely convinced that young people today have any less enthusiasm for democracy than their parents or their parents' parents did. In fact, I would say in some cases there's some really hopeful examples of young people who are passionate and active in their democracy. I think you know, we share their frustration, and again, that's probably not new. But I'm heartened by their desire to take action and to do something about it. So yeah, it's kind of like this two-faced problem, you know. And again, I would say that the two faces are probably, you know, like it is the two faces of the same coin. People are feeling a little bit disappointed in their elected representatives, in the state of the democracy, the gridlock over things like climate change and the fact that it doesn't seem like anything's changed. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they are wholeheartedly abandoning democracy. In fact, you know, some of them are going to the streets, and that's brilliant.
Yeah, for sure. And then, so if we take it, all right, so now we're talking pedagogy. I'm a teacher in the classroom, and I'll give you a lazy example of my own to give you something to hang it off. So I remember way back when, and I haven't taught history, humanities, we used to call it, for 5-6 years. Part of our civics concept was that you'd have the students do like a debate, and they'd all have their roles. There'd be the speaker for the house and the whatever. And almost without fail, at the end of that session, kids would walk out and go, "That was a mess, sir." And partly that's me as a fresh-faced teacher, not knowing how to manage the class properly. But then part of me sort of was like, well, have you seen question time? You know, like there's a certain raucous that's inherent in that. And especially through the vignettes throughout the book, I sort of got the same sort of feeling of sort of you went into the class at points thinking like, let's talk about refugees, or let's talk about this or that. And then, as you say, emergent learning emerged. And I think if I'm a fresh-faced teacher, which thankfully I'm not anymore, that's like a leap of faith or pedagogically a challenge. How would you kind of, let's say tomorrow, Justice Citizenship was rolled out instead of, you know, to replace something like a Discovering Democracy. How would you kind of sell that leap that teachers need to take from just talking at the front to listening?
Yeah. and you're absolutely right. It is in many ways a leap of faith. You know, it is being brave enough to say, you know what, I'm not going to stand out the front of the classroom, or I'm not even going to be the sage on the stage. I'm going to sit down with the students, and I'm just going to listen to them, and not talk any more than they do. And I think, you know, I always tell my teacher education students that you never walk into a classroom without a plan, and you never walk in without a backup plan, and sometimes even you need a backup for your backup. Okay, because, you know, teaching is about planning, and we'll talk about teaching as theatre, teaching as performance. And this is still teaching as theatre. This is still teaching as performance, but suddenly it's improvisation. You know, so we've gone from Shakespeare and now we're doing theatre sports, and it's everything's up for grabs. And I think before we even talk about content and structure and you know, what resources we might use, we need to talk about the environment in the classroom. And I would say it needs to be broader than that. It needs to be the environment in the school, in the community. And I think the very first thing that teachers need to be able to do, and they need to have the confidence to do this and the training to do this, is establish an environment where students' voices are valued, not necessarily uncritically accepted, because I would say that's almost the antithesis of what we're trying to do here, but certainly valued and discussed. And this notion that you know, a student's voice carries weight, and is less important. It's less important to get the right answer and more important to ask the right question. Now that sounds incredibly vague, and quite, you know, woolly progressive thinking, and I don't think it needs to be. You know, so in my little framework that I developed, I came up with like 6 features, and I think that provides a starting point to how you might think about doing that kind of thing. So the first thing, and you know, the place that I'd always start is, you don't need to do any of this on your own. In fact, it doesn't work with that. It's far better, you know, when I was starting to teach, we always used to talk about teaching with the door open, so other people could see your practice and you could see other people's practice. And I think we need to go beyond that and start teaching with the school gate open. Not literally. I understand the child protection requirements, but metaphorically speaking, you know, there are people out there who are more than willing to give up their time to come and visit you and talk to you about things, but don't leap into that without having consulted the students first. You know, so you know, school community partnerships. We know school community partnerships are good for schools regardless, but this is a real avenue, a real starting place for where just as citizens could start. You know, the other things that I think is moving towards experiential learning. You know, one of the, you know, when you write a PhD, you kind of got to find a way to get a quote from Plato or Aristotle or Socrates in there, right? And I think it was Plato who said something along the lines of, what we learn to do, we first learn by doing. You know, and I think that's exactly what we're talking about here. If we want to learn to be active citizens, we've got to do active citizenship. And you know, I think this is, again, such an incredibly rich opportunity. You know, Catholic schools where I've spent a bit of time teaching, they do some really interesting work around fundraising for things like Project Compassion. You know, lots of other schools have service learning programs. Other schools do lots of work around community education. Those are all brilliant examples of being active citizens. But I would suggest that going further than that, we need to be critical about it. You know, are we fundraising? How do we know it's effective? How do we know the money's going there? Is there a better thing that we could do? And sometimes there won't be, and sometimes there will be. You know, the same with service learning. You know, there are brilliant service learning programs out there, and there are equally ones that are, I find, quite troubling, because I question the value of them in actually being of service. And in some places, I question the value of the learning that takes place too. You know, and it's often linked to that notion of volunteerism, which can be unhelpful. You know, so but these are the questions you want to have. I'm not saying, you know, I expect, you know, fresh-faced teachers to have the answer to these, but I want them to have the questions, and I want them to have the questions with the students, and have those discussions, because that's the actual learning that's important. And you think about what you're modeling there, you know, and what students are learning. They're learning to ask critical questions, they engage in critical thinking, they probably do some research along the way. Yeah, it's exactly what we should be doing in schools, right?
Yeah, for sure. I'll link two questions together I've got for you. So my favourite idea related to this is, in Victoria at least, there's a really big movement towards student voice, and there's a whole bunch of schools that have committed middle leadership positions, so, you know, 3-6 periods given to developing student voice at the school. And because I'm a bit of a pain in the ass, my famous retort to those people is, oh, have you thought about the D word? And they all sort of look at me a bit confused. And then, of course, when I say democracy, they're sort of like, oh, yeah, we don't go that far. So the idea is that, you know, as you said, the students are given a limited purview into, you know, maybe they're sitting on a teacher hiring panel, or they're, you know, SRC reps, or, you know, very small limited examples, or they do a survey at the end of the year or whatever it is. And so linking that into what we've got down the bottom, what's realistically, what percentage do you think of students should have a voice? I mean, obviously, ideally it would be everyone, but in the realities that you know only too well within a school, what would be your kind of stretch goal? What percentage would we try and hit of students who had a voice, who were actively engaged in the school, etc.?
Yeah, this is, you know, controversial, but there are schools in Australia, in Melbourne, and around the world that run off a direct democracy model. You know, the most famous one is Summerhill, A.S. Neil's school in England. But you know, more broadly speaking, things like parts of the Montessori movement and the Steiner movement are built around this notion of students having a very open and honest say in how the school is run, and student voice, each student voice having just as much weight as each teacher voice. Now, some of those schools are brilliant, and some of them perhaps not, and that's the same of schools everywhere in the world, you know. But I do share some of your concerns about the D word, democracy within schools, and you know, the reality of it as opposed to, you know, how it's often implemented. When I was doing some of the research for the book, I spoke to some teachers about, you know, how they encourage student voice within their classrooms. And one of the things that they always say is, at the start of the year, we always come up with the school rules, the classroom rules. This is how we're going to behave. And I say, do you always have the same rules every year? And the teacher said, yes, of course we do. And I'm like, are they the rules you want? And they're, well, yeah, you know, but the students come up with it. And I'm like, well, yeah, it's not really, you know, democracy, isn't it? It's something performative about it, you know. And yeah, so I mean, how do we move beyond tokenism? How do we move up that old metaphor of the ladder of participation and get to something that's much more meaningful? That's a challenge. But it's not entirely one way either. You know, if we go back to the Plato quote about what we learn to do, we learn first by doing. It's not just about rights, you know, and contributing to, you know, the school civic sphere. You know, I think teachers and student voice leaders need to lean back quite heavily and say, you know, there are significant responsibilities involved in this. Just like I, as a teacher, have responsibilities to you. You know, if you're going to be part of this community, and everybody has to be part of this community, we have to acknowledge the responsibilities that we have. You know, because that's often left out. You know, we've all had those classroom arguments and discussions, usually with Year 9 boys, in my case, where they know their rights. You can't do this to me. I've got rights. And you say, yes, but you've also got responsibilities. And, you know, so I think that's really important. But I mean, you know, why couldn't it be 100%? It's not a technological problem. You know, there's no reason why everybody can't be involved in school decisions, or at least have the chance to consult on school decisions. And I'd say, you know, we need to go even further beyond that. You know, why don't we have community groups within schools making decisions or contributing to the decisions? I know in the UK they have a governor model. So each school has a board of governors who look after the school. And sometimes some of the more progressive schools have student governors on that. But I mean, the problem there is that there is naturally this quite significant power imbalance where you've got a student in Year 8, no matter how confident she or he might be, you know, they will always think twice about telling the principal, for example, what they really think of one of the principal's ideas. But that's a cultural problem. That's not going to change overnight. It's not going to change by saying, hey, we're going to have 20 student leaders as opposed to 10. But it's something that, you know, principals can work towards over a period of years.
Sure. Might just do two more. In terms of, we've talked about students, activists, citizens. How does the sort of teacher fit into this? So we've touched on the fear of politicization before. And, you know, we probably haven't covered the activist teacher. And obviously that's what in your past life, not that long ago, a couple of years ago, that you were involved with. How do you sort of expect teachers to navigate their role as activists within the sort of space?
Yeah. And that's always the challenge. I don't know any teachers, and I've worked with, spoken to, and taught hundreds of teachers. I don't know any teachers who became teachers, you know, to really, really teach algebra fantastically well. Okay, I mean, lots of them do, and I'm filled with admiration for those who do. But it's not about the algebra. It's about you know, giving people opportunities, making life better. You know, teachers as a whole, it's a selfless, sacrificing profession. You know, and we've talked about how important it is. You know, and people get into it. People become teachers because they want to make a difference. So, you know, my argument is we're already activists. We're trying to change society for the better. And, you know, we can disagree about what that means, but we're all already on the side that, you know, having a more educated populace makes society better. And you know, it's a public good. That's why education is publicly funded. You know, so I think we're already activists. And I think if we're honest as teachers, we put so much of ourselves into what we do, whether we're conscious of it or not, that to deny that we do that, I think, is a little bit dishonest, or at least a little bit, you know, misleading. You know, the examples we choose, the language that we choose, the way we speak to students, you know, the conversations we have on the playground, they are all, you know, political acts, for want of a better word, you know, small p political, but they're still political acts. And the moment we start denying that, you know, and the moment we start rejecting that, we actually are supporting the status quo. You know, we're saying, no, we're not going to change it. We're not trying to change it. And I don't think, you know, that's defensible. You know, while there is still injustice in society, and there is, you know, there's injustice for everybody, you know, oppression anywhere is oppression everywhere, right?
All right, last question, an easy one. Give us the elevator pitch for your book. So if I'm a teacher or I'm a researcher, we've just stepped into an elevator, you got 5 minutes or less, or whatever you can do. What's the sell for teachers, for researchers to your book, and maybe remind us what it's called as well?
Okay. I should have practiced this, I guess. So, yeah, the world is, you know, we're all sick of the phrase unprecedented times, but it certainly seems like every moment becomes more and more unprecedented, from, you know, especially in Australia, where we seem to jump from bushfires to a pandemic, and now, you know, where I live in Sydney, half of Sydney it seems like it's underwater at the moment. And I think, you know, we as people have very human reactions to this, and we want to know what we can do about it and how we can help. And one of the things that I think the purpose of education is, one of the most important things that we do, as well as, you know, basic literacy and numeracy, is we teach people how to participate in society, how to be citizens and community members, and how to work together. That's the important thing, work together to make society a better place. And that's what I'm trying to do with my book. It's easy to say that. It's much harder to actually come up with a pedagogy that attacks you know, the fundamental injustices in our society, and says this is how we can make young people who are going to make a difference in the future. And that's what I'm trying to do in Activist Citizenship Education, a framework for creating justice citizens.
Beautiful. All right. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Stephen.